Okay, I think we can get going. Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Moses. I'm president of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, also known as LESB. I'm here with Laura Sewell, who heads up LESB's programming. I'm glad to welcome you to our webinar tonight, LGBT History of the Lower East Side, presented by the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project. Those of you who aren't familiar with LESB, we're a not-for-profit group whose mission is the preservation of the historic Lower East Side, which includes the East Village, Lower East Side below Houston Street, Chinatown, Little Italy, and the Bowery. We work to preserve the Lower East Side primarily through advocating for New York City Landmarks Commission designation of individual landmarks and historic districts for historic streetscapes and individual historic buildings. Along with preserving the area's beautiful historic architecture, we also push to maintain the traditional culture and diversity of the Lower East Side, one of the most important areas of the country due to its immigration, political, and artistic history, a living history that continues with us to the present day. During the lecture, please put any questions you have in the Q&A section, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. And although we may not be able to answer everyone's questions, we'll answer as many as we can. Now we're going to do a quick poll to see where everybody lives. Don't worry, it's anonymous and should only take a minute or two. Okay, I think we can wrap this up. And as you can see, most people live in New York, outside the traditional Lower East Side, with a little less than a third living in the Lower East Side, and a few outside the United States, which is always nice to see. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'd like to now introduce our speakers for tonight, Amanda Davis, Jay Shockley, and Ken Lesbader with the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project. This wonderful organization is a cultural initiative and educational resource that's making an invisible history visible by documenting extant historic and cultural sites associated with the LGBT community throughout New York City. On a personal basis, I've known Amanda, Jay, and Ken for a very long time. Actually, Jay and Ken a bit longer than that. Jay and I worked together at the New York City Landmarks Commission back in the 90s. And Ken, Jay, and I were involved in an organization around that time that took very early steps to document LGBT history and historic sites in New York. So in any case, I'm very happy that they can all join us this evening. And I think we'll start with Amanda, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, LESB, for having us here tonight to talk about the Lower East Side. This is a painting by Martin Wong, and Ken will be talking more about this artist later on in the program. The NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project was founded in 2015 by historic preservation professionals to document the cultural heritage of the city's LGBT community through historic buildings and landscapes. We not only recognize LGBT-specific history, but also the community's influence on America. Our website features a map of now over 370 sites in all 5 boroughs of New York City from the 17th century to the year 2000. Pins are coded by the 8 colorful site types you see on the right. The goal of the project is to broaden people's knowledge of the city's LGBT history beyond the globally recognized Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, and to connect that history to many of the places we walk past every day. We also want to impact LGBT youth, particularly those who may feel isolated and in need of historical role models. We use this slide of sites associated with James Baldwin that you see here as part of an educational guide for high school teachers and students in partnership with the city's Department of Education. Baldwin is taught in the school system's curriculum already, And we wanted students and teachers to think about how these sites and the neighborhoods they're in helped shape his life as a gay Black writer and activist. Our website also features 30 curated collections that organize sites by theme, allowing people to explore LGBT history through various time periods, such as pre-20th century history or activism before Stonewall, groups of people, such as transgender history or communities of color, geographic locations, such as activism outside Manhattan, or cultural and artistic movements, such as the Harlem Renaissance and the downtown art scene. These provide a great overview and introduction to the kinds of sites our project documents. Our project has also nominated a few sites on our website to the National Register of Historic Places, which is the federal government's honorary list of sites that have been deemed significant to American history. In 1999, the Stonewall Inn became the first site to be listed for LGBT significance anywhere in the country, and it was written by two of our project founders. The project team and consultants wrote the other nominations, with the exception of the Bayard Rustin residence, which was written by a colleague of ours in DC. We've also worked with the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which, as many of you know, is the city agency that regulates designated landmarks and provides the strongest form of protection for historic buildings. The commission designated the Stonewall Inn a local landmark in 2015, and after reviewing our list of recommendations for more LGBT landmarks in 2019, they designated the six other buildings that you see here. And we've also sent another list of sites for them to consider. To help contextualize the Stonewall Uprising, we worked with the National Parks Conservation Association to create this walking tour map of sites around Stonewall National Monument, giving people a much broader understanding of gay life and activism in the vicinity of the monument. A digital version is available on our website's resource page if you're interested. And we get the word out about the project through our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. And also during the pandemic, we've been providing Zoom talks and putting those recordings on our YouTube page. So we invite you to check those out. Refocusing our attention to the Lower East Side tonight, project co-director Jay Shockley will share LGBT sites associated with immigration and theater. Then co-director Ken Lesbader will discuss sites associated with the arts and then with nightlife. And I'll be finishing up with a look at sites associated with activism. So I'll hand this over to Jay.
Thanks, Amanda. As she said, next slide, please. We're showing a sampling of sites associated with the Lower East Side that reflect the late 19th and early 20th century histories when this neighborhood, as you all know, was the hot spot for recent immigrants to New York City. Excuse me. And again, a reminder, today the Lower East Side sometimes is just meant as the lower portion of Manhattan, but during this period, it really went all the way up to Union Square, a little bit above 14th Street, all the way down to Lower Manhattan. So the first site on our website is the Henry Street Settlement. In 1893, public health nurse and progressive reformer Lillian Wald co-founded the Henry Street Settlement to provide no-cost medical services to poor immigrants living in the cramped tenements of the Lower East Side. Next, please. Relocating the facility to its current location in 1895, Wald and her compatriots established successful careers separate from the traditional roles then expected of middle-class women. Wald is well documented as having relationships with several other women who lived and worked at Henry Street, as well as several of the wealthy patrons of the settlement. Next. In addition, several blocks away from the actual settlement buildings is this playground named for her. The land was acquired by the city in 1931. Parenthetically, the project just listed about 20 playgrounds, parks, and monuments in the city, spurred by the fact that last year, a number of parks and playgrounds were named after Black individuals, two of them specifically calling out lesbians. And so we looked into the entire named playgrounds and parks and found about 20, all of them, excuse me, inadvertently named for LGBT individuals. Next. This was an extremely rare situation when this playground was named after somebody who was still alive. And in fact, Lillian Wald attended the opening ceremony in 1937. Next. Our next site represents immigrant anarchist leader Emma Goldman, who is the very first prominent figure and ally in the United States to publicly speak out in support of homosexual rights. From 1903 to 1913, she lived on the 6th floor of this East Village tenement, and for several years, beginning in 1906, had an office in the building next door for her Mother Earth publication. Next. While historians have debated Goldman's sexuality, some argue that surviving letters provide rare known evidence that she may have had a relationship with another woman. Goldman's active opposition to World War I ultimately led to her deportation in 1919 in the horrible days of Woodrow Wilson's administration, when they were attacking pacifists, socialists, and all manner of progressive groups in New York in particular, in the United States, and deporting them. Next, please. Webster Hall is one of New York's most historically and culturally significant large 19th century assembly halls, the venue for countless events, including working class and immigrant population conventions and political and union rallies. Next. It became famous for its bohemian masquerade balls in the 19-teens and 20s. And we noticed recently in this particular image that it's a rare instance of a totally racially integrated public event in Lower Manhattan. It was significant as a gathering place for the city's early 20th century lesbian and gay community, who felt welcome to attend these balls in drag and then sponsored their own events by the 1920s. Next. Among the many LGBT notables who attended events here at the time were artist Charles Demuth and writer Jejuna Barnes. Next, please. We have a number of theater-related sites on our website, and what's really interesting is that the East Village in particular from the 1950s on became one of the most important locations for off and particularly off-Broadway theater. The Lewis and Jaffe Art Theater is the single most tangible reminder of the heyday of Yiddish theater in 20th century New York, when venues of this kind lined Lower 2nd Avenue. Next. Except for a few years when it operated as a movie theater, the building was used continuously as a Yiddish theater from its opening in 1926 until 1945. And unfortunately, we currently do not have any LGBT associations for this particular building with Yiddish theater. If anybody in the audience knows of any really good links or contacts, we would love that, because there would have had to have been LGBT associations with this as a Yiddish theater. We know for a fact there were some pioneering gender bending performances by Molly Bacone and others, but we haven't yet found any particularly gay or lesbian actors or actresses or producers or directors yet. Next. In the same building from 1945 to 1953, this was the location of the popular mafia-controlled 181 Club, which was dubbed in its day, quote, the homosexual Copacabana, due to the fact that it was one of the most luxurious clubs in the United States that featured lavish shows of what were then called female impersonators. Next. The building was particularly renowned from 1953 to 1961 as the very pioneering off-Broadway Phoenix Theater, one of the most important, prolific, and creative companies in New York of the time. It was co-founded by Norris Houghton, who was gay, who had experience in theater design and direction and became the Phoenix's artistic director. Over the course of 8 full seasons in this house, the Phoenix Theater presented an impressive array of American and European theatrical talent for both the stage and motion pictures, including many, many LGBT individuals. Next. This 1831 house on St. Mark's Place was the home from 1833 to 1842 of Alexander Hamilton's widow, Elizabeth, and various family members. It had a significant and colorful off-Broadway history, theatrical history, with a number of LGBT associations from 1955 to 1967, reflecting its location on St. Mark's Place during the cultural ascendancy of the East Village. Next. Actress and manager Julie Bavasso established and directed the nonprofit Tempo Playhouse starting in 1955, where she's credited with the American premiere of Jean Genet's The Maids. Next. Among several other uses, it was also the home of the Key Theater and the New Bowery Theater, which introduced early underground films, including the work of Jack Smith, seen on the left, and George and Mike Kuchar, and then later the Bridge Theater, which was especially noted for its contemporary dance performances. All of these venues suffered continual official harassment. Next. La Mama Experimental Theater Club was founded in 1961. Next. By Ellen Stewart, and it moved to 74 East 4th Street in the East Village in 1969. La Mama received Ford and Rockefeller Foundation's grants in 1967 that allowed for the purchase and renovation of this building, which was then in total ruins. Today, it's widely considered the oldest surviving, most influential, and most prolific of all the off-Broadway stages. Quote, or next, please. It's had associations with many, many LGBT playwrights, directors, and performers, including Charles Ludlam on the left and Harvey Fierstein on the right. Next. The La Mama building actually was constructed in 1873 for the Aschenbräutel Verein, a German-American professional orchestral musicians social and benevolent association. The main facade was altered in 1892 for the Gesangverein Schillerbund, one of the city's oldest German singing societies. Next. And finally, we have the WOW Cafe Theater, which was formed in 1980, standing for Women's One World Cafe Theater. And it currently bills itself as, quote, the oldest collectively run performance space for women and or trans artists in the known universe. Next. It's performed in this building on the 4th Arts Block since 1984, but was previously located in another storefront at 333 East 11th Street in 1982-84. Next. Among the many artists WOW has been associated with have been actor, writer, producer Peggy Shaw, and director, playwright Lois Weaver, as well as Lisa Cron and the 5 lesbian brothers. So I'm turning it over to Ken now.
Thank you, Jay. Good evening. In the latter half of the 20th century, before gentrification, the East Village and Lower East Side were places where young and emerging artists could afford to live and create. From the 1960s to 1980s in particular, a number of residences and studios are associated with a network of queer artists who often drew inspiration from each other and the neighborhoods in which they lived. The area was also home to a number of LGBTQ bars, clubs, gathering spots that were associated with nightlife, music, dance, and sex. And I'll be presenting a very brief selection of those, first focused on artists, followed by nightlife. And it's, as I emphasize, a very brief selection. Next. Located at 324 East 14th Street, This was the primary residence of prolific playwright, director, performer, poet, and Warhol superstar Jackie Curtis from 1974 to 1985. Born in 1947 as John Curtis Holder Jr., Curtis was raised on the Lower East Side and became interested in performing at a young age. Next. Curtis met Ellen Stewart, founder of La Mama, as a young teen, which eventually led to his long-term association with the theater as playwright, performer, or both. And in the mid-1960s, he adopted the name of Jackie Curtis and began creating a persona that defied gender stereotypes without attempting to pass as female. Throughout his life, he expressed elements of his personality that defied sexual or gender identity labels. And beginning in the late 1960s, his plays in which he performed the lead roles were produced at La Mama and elsewhere downtown. His work featured gender nonconforming actors and characters and themes that lampooned sexual and social conventions. And this is an image of him on the left as you can see from apartment 2B, which was in the front of the building. Next, please. In 1967, Curtis met Andy Warhol, and his association helped get his plays notice. Curtis, along with Candy Darling, shown on the right, and Holly Woodlawn, became known as the Warhol superstars and starred in a number of his films. Lou Reed immortalized Curtis in his 1972 song, Walk on the Wild Side, with the lyrics, quote, "Jackie is just speeding away, thought she was James Dean for the day, and then I guess she had to crash." And that is a reference to, he often went in male drag as a persona as James Dean in many occasions. Next. In the early 1980s, he continued to perform at several cabaret venues throughout the city and in the East Village, and most notably the Pyramid Club. And he died of an accidental drug overdose in 1985. And this is a shot of his bedroom, the living room, and another one on the right with his grandmother, who many of you on the Lower East Side or the East Village may know, a bar that was there called Slugger Ann that operated on 2nd and 12th for many, many years. Next. Chinese American artist Martin Wong, who you saw that in the first slide, was born in 1946 in Chinatown, San Francisco, and he moved to the Lower East Side in 1978 and relocated to this apartment building at 141 Ridge Street in 1982, where he also used it as his studio. He lived here until 1994. Next. He became known for his depictions of local street scenes and everyday people, as well as for his pioneering graffiti collection. And this is just a screenshot of his apartment and where he worked and painted. Next. Wong, who was openly gay, was an influential figure in the 1980s and 1990s downtown art scene, befriending the likes of David Warnovich and Keith Haring. And we should just mention that David Warnovich, as well as Peter Hujar, a photographer, lived at the Jaffe Theater for a number of years. We just didn't kind of overlay that until now. Perhaps Wong's most important friendship was with Miguel Pinheiro, writer and co-founder of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. Next. Wong's first neighborhood scene was Attorney Street, handball court with autobiographical poem by Pinheiro, which you can see on the right, that was painted in 82 to 84. And after it was completed, it was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. During his time on Ridge Street, his paintings mostly took inspiration from San Francisco's Chinatown neighborhood and Manhattan's Lower East Side neighborhood and Manhattan's Chinatown as well. And in 1989, he co-created the short-lived Museum of American Graffiti on Bond Street. 5 years later, he returned to San Francisco after his diagnosis with HIV/AIDS to be under the care of his family. And he died there in 1999 at the age of 53. Next. Pioneering pop artist Robert Indiana lived and worked on all 5 floors of this former industrial building at 2 Spring Street on the corner of Bowery from 1965 to 1978. Excuse me. Over the years, he took over the entire structure and working on separate floors for one separate floor for painting, another for drawing, sculpture, printmaking, and living. And in 1975, his lease expired, but he remained in the building until he was forced out in 1978. And at that time, he moved to Vinyl Haven Island in Maine, where he died in 2018. Next. His gay identity was often obliquely expressed in his paintings, sculptures, and prints. He was named Robert Clark at his birth in 1928 and born to a poor family in Indiana. And he moved to New York City in 1954 to pursue a career in art. He initially lived in Coenties Slip, which you could see her on the left, adjacent to the studio of Ellsworth Kelly, who became a lover at the time. In 1957, he changed his name to Robert Indiana. In response, he said to, quote, "the desire to have something unique and a name that was original and exclusive for my own use." Much of his artwork is autobiographical in some way, but the meaning is not always obvious. Many have meanings to do with identity and relationships. Next. Indiana's most famous work is the iconic Love, with the letters set on two levels with the O canted in a dynamic manner. Love can be read as a simple statement about relationships, or it can have a more layered interpretation. Next. The poet Frank O'Hara, born in 1926, lived at 441 East 9th Street with his on-again, off-again lover, Joe DeSore, from 1959 to 1963. He was an American poet and leader of the New York School of Poets, whose work first gained widespread recognition after it was included in the New York American Poetry, an anthology published in 1960. And he gained further recognition after the publication of his influential Lunch Poems. Next. That title refers to both O'Hara's capacity to write poems while sitting in Times Square during his lunch hour, as well as the ease in which a reader can take the pocket-sized volume along and read it at his or her lunch hour. O'Hara references several locations around his East 9th Street apartment in his poems. And according to a friend, O'Hara typed his poems at the kitchen table up there on the second floor between the first and second windows, accompanied periodically by the sound and the din of the 9th Street crosstown bus. Next. In 1966, O'Hara was tragically killed at the age of 40 after being run over by a beach taxi on Fire Island. And this is a Village Voice article of that period. Next.
Ken, before you go into Nightlife, you just missed Alvin Beltrop.
I did? Oh my goodness gracious.
Just so.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
That's what happens when your pages get stuck together. Well, let me go back here. The gay African-American photographer Alvin Beltrop was captured the unfolding LGBT life of the West Side Piers and elsewhere in New York. From 1975 until his death in 2004, he lived at 89 East 2nd Street. Next. He was born in 1948, raised in the Bronx, and he began capturing images as a teenager, producing voyeuristic work that became his signature style. In 1975, he moved from the Bronx to East 2nd Street, where he used his bathroom as a darkroom to develop and print the majority of all his photographic body of work. And that year began the beginning of his time frequenting Manhattan's West Side piers. Next. He spent over a decade photographing the dilapidated and abandoned piers and the artistic and emergent world of queer sexual life that developed there in the 1970s and 1980s. He was one of the few, if any, if only Black photographers capturing images there at the time. And he was completely unsuccessful, almost completely unsuccessful as an artist during his lifetime, and was never regarded in the same way as others such as David Wojnarowicz and others. And as an African-American, he faced racism and discrimination whenever he attempted to break into the art world. He only exhibited work twice in his lifetime. Once was at the Bar, which some of you may know, which was on East 4th Street and 2nd Avenue. It was a gay bar where he worked as a bouncer as well. And he died of cancer in 2004, and it was not until around 2008 that his work gained more appreciation and is now held in collections at the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney. And last year, basically, the Bronx Museum of Art had a retrospective of his work. So we're now going to Nightlife. Okay, and just forgive me here. Well, we're going to start. Nightlife here could be covering about easily an hour-and-a-half session. And just bear with me. We are starting with FAFS and the Loft next. This is at 645 Broadway, just north of Bleecker Street. It has 2 LGBT associations. Next, the first is for FAFS, which was a Rathskeller like beer and wine restaurant at the Coleman House Hotel. And it was a favorite haunt of bohemians in the 1850s, including poet Walt Whitman. You can see her on the right. It operated here up until 1864, and it became known as a place for men looking to meet other men. And although the underground vaulted space of FAFS is no longer there, the Coleman House Hotel and its basement does survive. Next. The second association with this location is the second floor residence of David Mancuso and what became known as the Loft, his house party that was invitation only and held weekly Saturday nights from around midnight till 6 a.m. It operated here from Valentine's Day 1970 to June 1974 and was one of the most influential house parties in this country. His goal was to create an egalitarian and commerce-free space that broke down racial, sexual, and economic barriers. The Loft was an alternative to the city's commercial nightlife scene and became a model for future LGBTQ and straight parties and clubs. DJs and remixers of these went to the Loft and were regular attendees, and in many cases opened their own spaces or became DJs at other places, including Larry Levan, who was famously associated with the Paradise Garage. It was the most influential club of its era and a model for other clubs, including the Saint, which I'll mention in a moment, and Studio 54. Next. By June 1974, the Loft relocated to 99 Prince Street in Soho. It operated here from 1975 until 1985, later moving back to spaces in the East Village and elsewhere. And this is just an image of protests of it moving. When it moved to Prince Street, people didn't want it there. They thought it was going to be associated with drugs and nightlife and things like that, which is sort of interesting that the nearby, the firehouse, which was a big LGBT meeting space, never got that kind of pushback from the community. Next is the Saint, which was located at 105 6th Street and referred to as the Vatican of Disco. It was a gay members-only club that operated from September of 1980 to May of 1988. The building originally opened in 1926 as the Commodore Theater and became the Village Theater in 1963, showing off burlesque Yiddish vaudeville, as well as off-Broadway productions. From 1968 to 1971, it was space to the legendary Fillmore East Music Hall. Next. In the late 1970s, entrepreneur Bruce Mehlman partnered with designer Charles Terrell to develop and create the Saint. Mehlman purchased the building to accommodate his vision of a multi-level extravagant club, including a planetarium, which became the Saint's trademark. Soon after opening, it became the underground gay club in New York City. Its name inspired in part from the nearby New St. Mark's Baths, which Mehlman owned and opened up a year before the Saint opening. Next. The space contained a 4,800 square foot circular dance floor topped by an aluminum dome ceiling that served as a theatrical scrim, hiding nearly 500 speakers. A star projector, which you could see here detailed in the promotional poster, rose from the center with about 1,500 fixtures to create various light shows, including scenes of nighttime, sky, sunrise, and cosmos. The construction costs for the Saint were totaled over $4.6 million compared to the $400,000 that was invested to open Studio 54 in 1977. And on average weekend, 4,000 men attended the club per night, catering to a mostly white a group of men that also frequented Fire Island a lot, and who could afford the annual membership fees that were quite steep. And the Saints Bylaws expressly focused on creating an all-male space. And I don't know if you could see it or if any of our images are blocking the notes on the Saint on the right. This is a promotional piece that was sent out, and it says it's primarily a space for dancing for men. Next, the AIDS epidemic impacted attendance, and by the mid-'80s, Mailman and the other management changed it from a male-only policy that allowed women and straight nights. By 1988, Mailman decided to close the club and had a send-off that consisted of a 40-hour continuous music production. And the facade and the lobby are extant, but in 1996, the building auditorium was demolished to make way for a residential building. On the left here is the Black Party, the first Black Party. I mean, it was officially anointed at the Saint, with Robert Mapplethorpe's photograph using for the promotion. Next. And then I just want to touch on briefly at 6 St. Mark's Place, where Mailman's the new St. Mark's Baths that operated here from 1979 to 1985, when it was closed by the city due to the AIDS epidemic. The space opened as the St. Mark's Baths circa 1915 as a Turkish and Russian baths, and converted over time by the 50s and 60s. It was a dilapidated bathhouse for men, and Mailman basically wanted to reopen it and market it as the most extravagant, largest bathhouse in the country, which it was. So that is it. And now I toss it back to Amanda.
Thanks, Ken. So I'm going to end the evening with a look at Lower East Side sites associated with activism, either LGBT specific activism or contributions that LGBT people have made to other activist movements. The first is the back building behind this tenement at 217 Mott Street between Prince and Spring Streets, where Igal Rudenko and Bayard Rustin lived in separate apartments. Both gay men, one Jewish and the other African-American, were active in the civil rights movement and were also conscientious objectors and pacifists. This is a 1950s Bromley map with a turquoise arrow pointing to the back building. The photo on the right is the entrance to this building, which was accessed from the courtyard. Rudenko lived in an apartment here from 1947 to at least 1972. And we know that Rustin lived in apartment 2 on the floor below Rudenko from 1947 to 1954. Interestingly, they both moved to Mott Street the same year they took part in the influential Journey of Reconciliation of 1947 as members of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. The two orange arrows in the group photo at left point to Rudenko and Rustin, respectively. This was an early civil rights action involving segregated buses in the South. And while not considered a success, the event demonstrated the value of nonviolent direct action, which later became a hallmark of the civil rights movement and inspired the freedom rides of the 1960s. Rustin went on to have a storied career as a civil rights leader, despite the fact his legacy is not as widely known because of prejudice towards his homosexuality. He became the chief advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 60s, and was the lead organizer of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which is now largely remembered for Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. From that point until his death, he lived in an apartment in Chelsea that is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Rudenko was a leader in the anti-Vietnam War movement and led the first demonstration against the United States military's involvement. He was also a longtime member of the War Resisters League, as was Rustin, which is the country's oldest secular pacifist organization. And on the left is him in his office at 339 Lafayette Street. He was also active in Black and White Men Together, which later changed its name to Men of All Colors Together, a group dedicated to addressing racism in the LGBT community. And this is a photo on the right of Rustin and Rudenko in India, showcasing their lifelong friendship. An early example of LGBT-specific activism took place outside the Great Hall at Cooper Union on December 2nd, 1964, and this was actually the second ever public demonstration for gay rights in the United States. By the early 1960s, the prevailing psychiatric viewpoint that homosexuality was a disease was already under attack. In 1961, the book, The Myth of Mental Illness, took on the quote-unquote mental health profession and became a valuable tool for the early gay rights movement. A year later, a psychiatrist, Dr. Paul R. Dintz, who had contributed to Homosexuality, a Psychoanalytic Study of Male Homosexuals, a book that was largely negatively received by the gay community, was invited as part of the Cooper Union Forum series to give a lecture titled Homosexuality, a Disease. Early gay rights activist Randy Wicker, seen at left, organized a small picket at Cooper Union, and he was joined by two other gay men. One was probably Craig Rodwell, who, among other things, went on to open the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop. And they were also joined by lesbian activist Kay Lahusen, who at the time went by the pseudonym Kay Tobin. Wicker was able to speak at the forum, challenging the disease theory of homosexuality and receiving more applause than Dr. Dintz. At right is an article about the picket written by Lahusen for The Ladder, the monthly publication of the Daughters of Bilitis, the first lesbian rights group in the United States, which was formed in 1955 in San Francisco with a New York chapter opening in 1958. And speaking of the Daughters of Bilitis, the one-time vice president of the group's New York chapter lived in an apartment in this East Village tenement on 12th Street between First Avenue and Avenue A, and this was Ernestine Eckstein, a pseudonym for Ernestine Eppinger. And while my focus tonight is on Eckstein, I wanted to point out, as many of you may already know, that this building was also one of several East Village residences that poet Allen Ginsberg was associated with over the course of his adult life. He lived here from 1975 to 1996. Eckstein was first involved in the Black Civil Rights Movement and came to New York in 1963. She lived in that East Village apartment from 1964 to 1968, which were her most influential years as an LGBT rights activist. In addition to her leadership roles with the Daughters of Bilitis, Eckstein participated in two pickets in 1965 to bring attention to discrimination against LGBT people. Here you see two images from an October 1965 picket in front of the White House. She's holding a sign that reads, "Denial of equality of opportunity is immoral." Photos indicate that she was one of a handful of women, as well as the only participant of color. Of course, the civil rights movement was also in full swing at this time and included several prominent Black gay men and lesbians, such as Bayard Rustin, James Baldwin, and Lorraine Hansberry, all New Yorkers featured on our website. Eckstein was also became the first American lesbian of color to be featured on the cover of The Ladder. And here she is on the June 1966 cover at right. The magazine had begun showing photos of real women in 1964, a then radical concept and a stark contrast to the line drawings of previous years, such as the one seen on the left of this 1957 cover. Eckstein wished to bring more progressive changes to the Daughters of Bilitis, but was met with challenges, leading her to step down as vice president the same month she appeared on the Ladder's cover. She eventually left for the San Francisco Bay Area, and while little is known about her later life, she was involved in Black feminist issues with the group Black Women Organized for Action. The more radical approach that Eckstein had envisioned for the movement foreshadowed LGBT activism in the post-Stonewall era, with the formation of groups such as the influential Gay Activists Alliance, which was headquartered at a firehouse on Worcester Street in Soho that Ken mentioned earlier, we have on our website, and is now a New York City landmark for its association with GAA. GAA organized a large number of ZAPs, which were direct, surprise public confrontations with political figures, corporations, and government agencies regarding gay rights and discrimination. ZAPs were designed to get the attention of gay and straight media. One ZAP was held at NYPD headquarters at 240 Center Street on November 11th, 1972. Here you see a press release on the right by GAA's News and Media Relations Committee. GAA led this protest, which was joined by other groups, to bring attention to police harassment of gay people their refusal to come to aid of the LGBT community when it was actually needed, and their use of obsolete sodomy and solicitation laws. One of the speakers at the protest was City Councilman Eldon R. Klingon, who had initially sponsored Intro 475 in the City Council in January 1971 to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, but it had failed to pass. GAA spokesman Ronald Gold criticized then Mayor John Lindsay for his failure to follow through on his promises of support for LGBT rights. And I just want to point out that this is one of 18 zaps that we include in our GAA curated theme, which is available on our website and Jay very painstakingly put together. Here you see one held at City Hall, another across the street at the Municipal Building, and one in Midtown at the Hilton Hotel. Another important group of the post-Stonewall era was the Gay Liberation Front, or GLF. This tenement building on 6th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues was home to 3 GLF activists, then partners Ellen Brody and Linda Rhodes, who lived in a 5th floor apartment from 1967 to 1971, and Rita Mae Brown, who rented the apartment next door for a couple years in the late 1960s. All 3 women were also members of Radical Lesbians. While living here, Brody was also the first president of NYU's Student Homophile League, which was later known as NYU Gay Students Liberation. Brody and Rhodes, along with Craig Rodwell and Fred Sargent, are also considered the founders of the New York City Pride March, which first took place in 1970 on the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. Rita Mae Brown was an influential writer who went on to write the 1973 best-selling lesbian-themed novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle. Brody, Rhodes, and Brown all took part in the Lavender Menace action at the Second Congress to Unite Women in 1970, which successfully brought attention to lesbian involvement in the women's rights movement. The photos that you see here are from that action, and you can see women wearing Lavender Menace shirts. The action itself was planned in Brody and Rhodes' East Village apartment. The West 17th Street School building in Chelsea, where that conference took place and where these photos were taken, is on our website if you're interested in learning more about this particular action. LGBT activism expanded in the early 1980s with the onset of the AIDS epidemic. We feature a number of AIDS activists and groups on our website, and if there are any that lived or met on the Lower East Side, please let us know and we'd love to add them to the website. In 1995, this former public school on Rivington between Eldridge and Forsyth opened as the largest residential healthcare facility for AIDS patients in New York City, and perhaps the nation. It was equipped with over 200 beds and an outpatient treatment center, and was originally considered an end-of-life nursing home for most of its patients, with a length of stay between 12 to 15 days on average, and a death rate at nearly 50%. By 1997, new drug therapies were prolonging the lives of many people living with AIDS. The death rate at Rivington House declined, and the length of stay increased as people were able to live longer. Unfortunately, Terry Miller was one person who died of AIDS-related complications at Rivington House in 1995. Miller had been a long-term Greenwich Village resident who had written text and contributed 150 of his own photographs to the 1990 book, Greenwich Village and How It Got That Way. And he also advocated for the preservation of historic blocks along the West Side waterfront. Rivington House operated until 2014, and a year later, in a controversial move, the city of New York sold it to a developer who paid to lift the building's deed restriction in order to create upscale residential housing. And finally, we'll take a look at activism in the form of addressing the needs of LGBT youth. Harvey Milk High School on Astor Place is a pioneering public school for LGBT students, and is also the only public school in the city to intentionally honor an LGBT person. The school was, of course, named for LGBT rights icon Harvey Milk, who, despite being so closely associated with San Francisco, was actually born and raised in Woodmere on Long Island. That's his yearbook photo on the left. And he began taking part in gay life in New York City when he was a teenager and into adulthood, although he was then politically conservative and closeted. In San Francisco, Milk would become one of the first openly gay elected officials in the United States before he was assassinated in 1978, a few months after the photo at right was taken. Harvey Milk High School was the brainchild of psychiatrists Dr. Emery S. Hetrick and Dr. A. Damian Martin, the two men sitting in the photo at left. They're pictured with their staff at the Institute for the Protection of Lesbian and Gay Youth, IPLG, which was founded in 1979 and later located on 23rd Street near Madison Square Park. The lower right image is from our site entry on IPLG's office there. Above it is our site entry for Washington Square United Methodist Church, where, among other LGBT-related history, was where Harvey Milk High School was first opened in the spring of 1985. After a stint at the LGBT Community Center on West 13th Street, the high school moved to IPLG's 23rd Street space. Today, it operates from 2 Astor Place. The goal of the school, when it first opened, was to address at-risk LGBT youth in the city affected by homophobia, physical abuse, homelessness, and other challenges. The school was established in collaboration with the city's Department of Education and became the first public high school in the country for youth victimized in public schools because of their sexual orientation or gender expression. And sadly, while both Hetrick and Martin died of AIDS in the late 1980s and early 1990s, their legacy lives on at Harvey Milk High School and IPLG, which was renamed the Hetrick-Martin Institute in their honor. HMI also operates out of 2 Astor Place. We at the project also paid homage to them at their gravesite in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn by placing rainbow flags there and sharing their story through our website and annual Gay Greenwood trolley tours in collaboration with the cemetery. So with that, we thank you all for coming, and we encourage your support of our project and for Lesbi, as always, by following us, donating, however you might be able to help support. So thanks for coming out, and Richard, I guess we'll take it to Q&A.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any open questions in the Q&A. People want to, real quick, add something add a question that they think the public may be interested in, please do. We had a couple of nice comments about some people that have experience with gay Yiddish theater star, a gay Yiddish theater star, and more LGBT background on the theater on 12th and 2nd, the Jaffe theater. So I think if we don't get any other questions, I want to say it was a wonderful presentation, really fascinating. I want to thank all, the 3 of you, Amanda, Ken, and Jay. It was really very eye-opening and wonderful to hear about. Now, for those of you who missed all or some of tonight's presentation, it'll be posted on our YouTube channel along with other past webinars that we presented. So if you go to our website, which you can see on the screen here, lesbi-nyc.org, you'll see a link on the homepage to our YouTube channel, and within a few days it should be up. I think, Ken, did you just raise your hand? Oh, you're muted.
Ken, you're muted.
Yeah, I just want to mention that, this is a drop in the bucket of what we have in the area as well. I mean, if you go on our website, you can filter Lower East Side and East Village and see the sites that we've documented and included on the website. We also have a working list that is not public, but of another 300 plus sites that we are going to be adding as time goes on. So, certain things on our website are missing, such as we don't have a location. We don't have an entry for the pyramid, which obviously is an important location to add, but we will be adding that down the road.
So if I can just chime in again to everybody in the audience, if you know of other places, please email us at the project and you can nominate them. We'll let you know if they're already in our database. And the individual who did the chat comment that something about early Yiddish theater, please email us so we can get in touch with you.
Yeah, I'll have to check out the website for the other entries for the Lower East Side, at least, not to mention the rest of the city. So please keep an eye out for future Lesbi webinars, including lectures such as this one and book talks. We're now planning, in celebration of the current reopening of Broadway, a webinar on the history of Lower East Side theater. That should be coming up in November. So keep a lookout for an email invitation that should be hopefully coming your way within a couple of weeks. And to keep up to date with what's going on with Lesbi, Lower East Side preservation, as well as with the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project, as Amanda had mentioned earlier, please follow us on our respective Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter sites. And again, reemphasizing what Amanda said, please consider making a donation today to one or both of our groups. We need donations to keep us going, keep us working, keep us active in preserving this important New York City history. So I think we got a couple of new things in chat. We'll just check.
Yes, and then Richard, there's a question. There's a question in the Q&A about how about the gay switchboard? And Jay, I can't remember if it's on our database to add.
We have a site for it.
Which one do we have?
In the West Village.
Yeah.
I think Amanda, you wrote that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Liberation Center.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's located on our website under Liberation Center, to answer that question. Richard, you were going to mention some of the chat questions?
I don't think they're questions, they're comments,
Oh.
you know, talking about nightlife, including the Pyramid Club, which you'd mentioned, and Boy Bar on St. Mark's.
Speaking of Boy Bar, that reminds me, the New Fest is going on right now through the 26th, and I would urge everybody that has any interest in the Lower East Side art scene of the 80s, you can stream a new documentary called Make Me Famous that is all about the East Village and like dozens of gay artists and so on. It's a very wild documentary, but quite interesting. And it's streaming until October 26th. You can just pay for that one stream.
Great, thank you.
And someone mentioned the 82 Club. That's actually an entry that Jay is working on. It's a lot going.
We've wanted to do it for a long time.
Yeah.
And if anyone hasn't seen the documentary, P.S. burn this letter, please. It's an amazing documentary with a lot of information about the 82 Club.
Also, another thing that's a free podcast called Mob Queens that talks about Anna Genovese, who ran the 181 Club and the 82 Club and had a number of lesbian relationships with her drag king bouncers and waiters.
And I see there's a question, please include religious gay organizations in the future, a number of which are included on our website, just not specifically associated with any locations we presented tonight in the East Village, but there are a lot of them. We were surprised that we had so many and many more. But if there's a specific one in the East Village or the village, or I should say this catchment area, let us know.
And particularly synagogues.
Yeah.
Okay. I see a new Q&A. Lesbian Bar Project. Eleanor asked about. I guess there's been if there's more information on lesbian bars.
Well, there is. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a question about the Lesbian Bar Project, which is there's a group of people documenting historic lesbian bars, or Gwen Shockey, who's done her MFA on it, as well as Addresses, which is a sort of narrative and a website that she's documented a lot. But we have a number of historic lesbian bars on our website and many more to add as well. And as many of you know, right now there are only 3 active lesbian bars in the city due to the closure of Ginger's in Brooklyn during COVID. But there's also, I'm forgetting the name of the project of, God, forgive me, of kind of similar to gay bars that are gone. It was a whole lesbian bar project looking at extant sites throughout the city that formerly housed lesbian or women-centric spaces.
And on our YouTube page, we also have a archived Zoom talk that one of our project consultants gave last year, Gwendolyn Siegel. She wrote her thesis at Columbia on lesbian bars in New York City, and then wrote entries on our website for those bars, and then put together that program. So that's on our YouTube page.
Well, talking about bars, we'll have a last call for questions. If anybody has anything on their mind before we sign off. Otherwise, I want to thank Amanda J. and Ken again for their great presentation and their great work for the city and the LGBT community. And I want to thank all of you for attending, and have a very good night.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.